Well, thank you very much, everybody. When you tell people that you do research into economic statistics and infrastructure, they tend to edge away from you at parties, but you're obviously a different kind of crowd today. I also want to thank all the organisers, the Council, for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a real honour to be here and in this fantastic room. There was, in fact, a fire alarm last time I was here, which was a year ago, so let's hope there isn't today. So I'm going to talk about getting beyond GDP, and you will know that there is quite a momentum now behind this beyond GDP movement, which has been going on for probably 20 years or so, or even longer on some counts, but it is really gripping the debate now about economic measurement. And John Hicks said that GDP is what the public thinks economists are selling as their main product. And it is, of course, used as a shorthand for how the economy is progressing. Are things getting better? And often economics students, and sometimes even some grown-up economists, don't think very much about how the GDP figures are constructed. You know, you download them and you run your regressions and take it as a valid shorthand for things getting better. But it wasn't until I wrote a book about GDP about a decade ago now that it really dawned on me that it isn't a natural object, it's an intellectual construct that was built around Keynesian economics and in the specific context of the Second World War. And so that framework means that although many people would think that it's something you can measure, like you can measure the height of a mountain or the distance between 2 points, it's an idea, and it's that idea that people are sensing doesn't actually capture what's happening in their society. So to give just one example of many, this is some recent polling from the United States, and the question is, thinking about the nation's economy, how would you rate economic conditions today? And so poor old Joe Biden is getting very poor ratings from the American public about the state of the US economy, which to any of us in an economy like the UK, if you look at the actual figures, which are on the right-hand side here, is a little bit puzzling. Even if you take out that spike up after the pandemic, US GDP growth has been something that we would be really pleased to have, and a little bit higher on average than the pre-pandemic period. So it looks like it's going absolutely fine. So that's one recent example. I could give you others of people sensing that GDP growth figures are not really capturing what's going on in their lives and in their society. And there are many possible reasons for that. One might be inequality, and that the median and the average growth rates are far apart. One might be precarity, that things look fine now, but people have this sense of uncertainty about their livelihoods. It might be inflation, which is affecting different groups differently. So there are a number of reasons why, just on the face of it, GDP growth might not be a straightforward metric of how things are going in people's lives. But what I want to focus on today are two big structural transformations that are going on in the economy. Two big general purpose technologies that are causing disruption, transformation in the organization and the supply side of the advanced OECD economies. And I'll talk about how hard that makes it to track what we think is going on and whether or not things are getting better. And the first of those is digital, of course. And this is a chart I use as a kind of shorthand for what digital change is doing to the creation of economic value. This is the material footprint of the UK economy in millions of tons per pound of GDP, indexed to 1970 equals 100. And you can see that there's this quite strong downward trend in the line. So this tells us not that we're using less stuff, that's not the story. It does tell us that per pound of GDP being created, an increasing share of that is intangible and not material. So the growth that we're experiencing in the UK and other advanced economies is increasingly intangible growth. Again, not that we're using less material, this intangible stuff adheres to tangible material stuff, but the value creation, what we're willing to pay for in the economy, is increasingly intangible. So that's the first one that I wanted to talk about. And the second is the energy transition. And so here's a chart from the US Energy Information Administration showing a projection for electricity generation in these different regions. I just noticed it's missed off the US, but it would be a similar pattern to Western Europe. The peaking soon, apart from in Africa, of fossil fuel generation and a transition to net zero generation. I mean, it'd be nice if it would happen faster, but here with digital and with energy and decarbonisation, we have got two general purpose technology transformations occurring at the same time. And these are always times of upheaval in the economy. If you think of the impact of the printing press as a communications technology, or the coincidence in the Industrial Revolution of telegraphs and railways and the steam engine, these are times when, as the name suggests, the whole economy gets rewired in different ways. Now, both of these are associated with challenges that might make people feel bad about what's going on. And my examples for digital come from the Daily Star, the newspaper of record. So when ChatGPT launched on an unsuspecting world in late 2022, the Star's take on this was psycho-robot scumbags, we promise not to kill humans, existential risk. When Elon Musk's Neuralink announced that it had successfully implanted a chip, car salesman Elon Musk hails new age after boffs plant chip in human brain. So that there are all kinds of reasons why we might be made to feel anxious by digital transformation. Existential risk, moral panic about teens on mobile phones. I'm very glad to see that nobody here is on their phone yet. Misinformation in an election year. All things that economists tend to ignore because we put them in, this is not the economy, we'll let somebody else worry about those. But maybe we should be thinking about the direction of innovation, and is all innovation good? And then on the other hand, there's the climate damage. This is randomly taken from Google search. It's San Diego a couple of months ago. So many countries are experiencing these extreme weather events. There's climate damage. We know that soil and water quality is deteriorating. Agricultural productivity is quite likely to plummet. So you might have robots picking the strawberries, but they won't grow in the first place. And economists have got better at integrating thinking about environmental damage into our assessment of economic welfare. And here the question might be the opposite, not why is there too much innovation or the wrong kind of innovation, but why is there not enough innovation? So integrating both of these might be a good thing to do if we want to think about economic welfare and economic progress. But what I want to ask is, well, just what about the economy now? What about how do we think about GDP growth? Never mind these distant structural problems, what's happening to the economy? And here what I have to show you, I don't know how easy it is to see at the back of the room, but it's a table updated from a 1994 article by Zvigrilicus in the American Economic Review. It's his presidential address. And he divided the economy into easy to measure and hard to measure sectors. And the easy to measure ones are the ones in black type at the top, and the hard to measure ones are the ones in red or paler type at the bottom. And so this is a somewhat ad hoc distinction, and he classed agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and transportation and utilities as the easy to measure parts because there were some obvious volume units and quality change wasn't affecting them as much as these other sectors. And even in 1990, when he published the figures in his paper, 69% of the economy, as he measured it, was hard to measure. This was up from 51% right after the Second World War, so that's already quite a big increase in hard to measure during those decades. What you could do is take out ICTs out of utilities and add those to the hard to measure category. And if you do that and update the table, which I've done in the final column here, you find out that 81.5% of the US economy is classed as hard to measure. Now, I love this paper. Zvigrilicus was one of my econometrics teachers in my PhD program. And so in this picture, he's the chap with the beard and the pointy hair, standing behind my friends Jonathan Leap and Don Hannah at our departmental picnic. And what he wrote, and I'm going to read this out to you, because this is the core of my argument, really, What is it about our data and data acquisition structure, and possibly also our intellectual framework, that prevents us from making more progress on this topic being, why is productivity growth slowing down? Is there something possibly wrong with the way we ask the productivity question, with the analytical framework into which we force the available data? I think so, and I think so too. And so a lot of my work recently has been trying to understand what it is that we're not measuring well, partly in the context of the productivity puzzle. Because a lot of what's been going on has been driven by digital transformation, which has been the focus of a lot of my recent research. And this transformation is driven by the decline in the cost of computing. In 2010, Bill Nordhaus published a paper showing the long-term decline in the cost of computing back to the year 1000, I think, using a standardized measure of computations per second. And he showed that it had declined rapidly, in any case up to about 1950, and then started to decline exponentially with the digital revolution, the computation revolution. So my co-author Lucy Hampton and I have updated this using a different measure of performance. And so we've got this chart with some complicated lines on it. Many people have said that Moore's law is slowing down, so the decline in the cost of computing is coming to an end. And Moore's law is the dashed line near the bottom of this chart. We then looked at two types of chip performance, the standard CPU chips and the new graphics processing chips that are being used in AI as well as in video gaming. And we also spliced them together in different ways. So the red line is the CPU index, the blue line is the GPU index, and the truth is probably somewhere in between those. And you can see, looking at those, that maybe the declining cost of computation in this engineering approach has slowed down a bit, but only since around 2010 or so. And actually, it's still been falling by around 40% a year, taking this whole period as a whole, which is an amazingly fast decline in the cost of doing computation using digital technology. For comparison, on this chart, you've got the official semiconductor producer price index for the United States. You could take a number of different indices, and they all look pretty similar. They are declining, but nothing like as much as the actual engineering cost of computation. Now, there's a caveat about this, which is that paying electricity bills is part of the cost of doing computation, and the externality, the shadow price of that energy use, is not included in this index, but nobody's paying that shadow price. And so the economic driver here is that people will do more and more computation because it is getting staggeringly much cheaper year by year, and that's still going on. And so that's what we're finding. And there have been amazing technological advances just since 2020. Here's a few of them. So the top one, smartphones and 3G, 4G and 5G mobile networks. 2007, the iconic moment when Steve Jobs, I should be wearing a black turtleneck to mimic Steve Jobs, but he stood there at the Apple event and showed us the iPhone. At the same time, the telecoms companies started investing in 3G, 4G and 5G. We got wireless networks available pervasively. We also got the mechanism design approaches that allowed people to design the software apps that we could put on our smartphones. And so since 2007, there has been a massive increase in the amount of time we as consumers spend online, all of the things that we can do, the services we can access through our smartphones, and also a change in business models. So companies established since 2007, as well as some older ones, often have a digital platform business model. So a huge change in the economy around then. In 2010, cloud computing, Amazon Web Services started selling externally the internal server services that it had created for its own use. 2014, Microsoft entered that market, followed by Google, and the price of cloud computing collapsed. And so I was involved with a big organization at the time, which had previously had to make an investment case for tens of thousands of pounds to spend on servers and in-house IT experts. And the head of research and development started being able to put it on his company credit card because the cost fell so much. So we've had all of these extraordinary innovations, and this doesn't even list the areas of research and development that are underpinned by cheap computation, like genomic medicine and biomedicine, or smart materials, or pharmaceuticals, or even the finance sector. And so a huge, huge increase in the use of data, the use of digital tools, change in business models, and yet productivity growth is slowing down. So that's the core puzzle. It seems to happen every time there's a step forward in digital technologies. Bob Solow famously made the same point in 1986, which was what prompted the Zvi-Griliches article in the first place. So in the context of that productivity debate, I want to highlight just 3 of the digital questions that raise some puzzles about how we think about the statistics, and therefore how do we conceptualize what's going on in the economy. And you'll know that there's a debate between productivity pessimists like Bob Gordon and Nick Bloom, who think that either the new technologies actually aren't very welfare creating, unlike the early 20th century innovations, or that the productivity of research itself is declining and the pace of innovation has slowed down. And then there are the optimists like Erik Brynjolfsson, who argue that it's just going to take time because people need to change the way they do things to take full advantage of the technologies. So I'm on Team Optimist. Basically, I think the technologies are harder to use than in the past, and so it is putting the onus on economic institutions and organizations. But I want to talk about the measurement and conceptual questions specifically. So I'll talk about 3 things that I've worked on: telecommunications services, free digital services like the ones we all use, and data. So this is a chart from a couple of papers that my co-authors and I wrote as a result of telecommunications engineers coming to the Office for National Statistics and saying, you're showing that dark line at the top of this chart as the price index for telecommunications services hasn't changed. What rubbish. We know that over this period there has been amazing technological progress. Compression has improved, speeds have improved, latency has improved. You need a quality adjusted index that shows that. So we came up with a range of options. The first thing was just to add properly data services and also access charges, which get you down from the dark line to the next line down. We also looked at a unit value index, which is the red line at the bottom. So that's somewhere in between no change, which was the old published series, and a 90% decline over the period of this 7 years on the chart. And a lot of possibilities in between. If you use revenue weights, you get something close to the higher end of this spectrum. If you use volume weights, you get something closer to the red line. What's the right one to use? Well, what ONS did, being a cautious organisation, was take the next line down, the most cautious alternative, feed it through the GDP sausage machine, and it obviously improved the productivity of the telecom sector itself and reduced the productivity of some of the other sectors in the economy. But it also added 0.6 percentage points to GDP in a level shift. That's worth having. But what is the right answer? If you think the revenue weights are the right answer, what you're saying is that telecommunications companies are creating value by charging more for SMS messages than for WhatsApp messages. And that doesn't seem right. That's just an artifact of the fact that people are only slowly adjusting from traditional services to internet-based services. But if you use volume weights, then what you're saying is more data is always better. And that doesn't seem quite right either. And actually, if you think about it, the value isn't in the services themselves, it's in what we can do with it. The demand is derived because, as with any infrastructure, it's not valued so much in itself as for the possibilities, the economic possibilities it enables. So there are some really meaty economic puzzles here, I think. We know that data usage has absolutely exploded. You see any of the charts and they go up exponentially, and we're all doing all of these things online. The telecommunications companies have innovated. They've got lovely fibre optic cable. They've been investing a lot in 5G and so on. But there's also a lot of improvement in sectors that are adjacent to those, like the data centres, where again, the service quality and speed and so on are increasing all the time. Or in complementary services, the content that sits on those telecom services, which is what we really want. So how should we think about what's the right thing that we should be trying to measure a quantity of and a price of? Because it's a bundle, people are buying the bundle. And relatedly, should we be thinking about all bytes of data being the same, or should we somehow feed in diminishing returns to data? And what about a time budget constraint? You can only spend 24 hours a day online, so should we be thinking about a time price as well as a monetary price when we're thinking about what's the economic price, what's the shadow price of these kinds of services? So the bundle is creating value because there are complements in the bundle, and often when we're building a price index, we're thinking about the components as being substitutes for each other. So what's the right way to think about this? Similarly, if we think about our smartphones, and you'll often see this kind of list online of all the things that you now get in your smartphone, valued in 2022 prices at over €1 million, and they're expensive devices for sure, but we're not paying that much for them. And again, this is changing all the time. In a way, this is an old problem. This isn't a new goods problem or a new varieties problem in constructing a price index. What we rely on in the official figures is that the less people buy cameras or the less they buy a games console separately, then the revenue weights on those items will go down the price index, so eventually that will show up, and we'll adjust for the switch from having separate devices to one device over time. But we're missing an awful lot of the initial increment in consumer surplus by relying on that. And this is a constant problem. There are constantly new things being made available on the smartphones that most of us carry now. And the latest would be, for example, health devices. So very few of us are stopping buying our own blood pressure monitors, but we're now able to carry one around in our pockets all the time. So that's my first issue. How should we think about what is a good and what is the price of a good when we've got this kind of bundling going on? The second issue is about free digital services. And there are a number of ways people have been thinking about this and introducing it into the GDP figures. One is to treat it as an imputation in the way that we impute a lot of financial services activity or rent. But the most popular, or at least the most frequently tried, is state of preference surveys. And this is a table from a paper that my co-author David Nean and I wrote, looking at the stated value, the willingness to accept the loss of about 30 free goods. We threw in there some non-digital free goods like public parks. We've also got some paid-for goods as a kind of check on the figures that people were coming out with. And we had the good luck to run this in February 2020 and got the first column of results, and this table shows average and median. And then luckily for us, we got this wonderful natural experiment of COVID, and so we were able to run it again in May 2020 and February 2021. And you'll see from the table, and again, it's probably not very visible from the back of the room, but there's quite a range in a very plausible way among these different goods, a range in the numbers and also in the distributions. So for example, the distribution for personal emails and for online search is pretty much normal, whereas the distributions for something like social media, Facebook, is bimodal. There are super users who love it, and then many who are not bothered and don't use it at all. But we got reasonable changes between the three different surveys. Online shopping, for instance, increased substantially, both February 2020 and then May and February 2021. We get reasonable kinds of demand curves, can construct reasonable demand curves for them. And I've shown you online grocery shopping and public parks. You can see how they both shift, online grocery shopping in particular between the lockdowns. I should say the intuition is the opposite here for a normal demand curve, because we're shifting the volume. then the flatter the line, the less elastic is the demand there. But that all looks like a pretty reasonable set of results. This might be a good way to think about what's the economic welfare created by these free digital goods. But there's a challenge in thinking about this in the context of the economy as a whole and economic aggregates, which is, what's the budget constraint? Because if somebody comes to you to survey how much would you need to be paid to lose one of these digital goods, and then you get 30 goods, and then you get 100 goods, there's no constraint on the amount that you can answer. And the next step, I think, in this kind of work is to figure out how to introduce a time budget constraint into digital activity. So I'm sure you've heard about the concept of the attention economy. We do have limited time and limited mental bandwidth, and so somehow that's something that needs to be brought into play in thinking about the economics of all of these free digital goods. The final area I wanted to look at is data. And the cliche is data is the new oil, or sometimes data is the new gold. The idea being that it is just a fundamental input into economic activity now. And it's an immensely commercially prized asset that many companies have. And so even in the non-digital sector, getting the UK banks to make available in standardized format enough of their customer data that open banking can operate and new entrants can come into the market has been like drawing blood from a stone. So we know it's valuable, so what is the value? And the answer is nobody knows. And there are lots of different attempts to think about a method for valuing data. This complicated chart just divides up the types of methods that there are. There are very few data markets, that's the problem. Ironically enough, one of the most active is the dark web, where you can buy people's personal data when it's been hacked. There are markets for financial data. Bloomberg and Reuters sell financial data. That's very standardized in format, and so that market has developed over many decades. There is consumer credit data for sale, but if you look at the websites of the companies that sell it, they don't post prices. You have to ring up the salesman, and he will try to extract from you however much they think you're going to be able to pay for access to a lot of consumer credit data. The Chinese authorities have started trying to experiment with data exchanges, again in standardized formats, such as CV data to create a kind of job market information exchange. But the volumes are very thin, and they're not delivering very standardized prices. And that's the trouble. Data records are not standardized. What is a unit of data? Well, it depends what it tells you. That depends on the context. It depends on what you're able to use it for. And so thinking about any standardized method is going to be problematic. It's now become important enough that national statistics agencies are going to include data as an asset in the national accounts when the revisions are published in 2025. And they're going to do that by using the sum of costs. How much does it cost to create a database and maintain it? And that's probably, although not certainly, quite a cautious estimate, because you would think that people were only going to spend less than the value they would get from using the data. But there's this whole array of other possibilities, and again, we have done some experiments trying to think about different approaches. So we have a method looking at a real options approach to measuring data. We've used discrete choice experiments to try to get economists to tell us how much they valued certain characteristics of data sets that they use. So not straightforward, but an incredibly important economic asset that we're just at a bit of a loss to know what to do about. So this is where I get to in thinking about all of this. We're using real GDP as our rule of thumb for whether the economy is getting better or not, but I love this quote from Thomas Schelling that we don't know what real means. It's a hypothetical. What we call real magnitudes are not completely real, only the money magnitudes are real. The real ones are hypothetical. And he points out that the deflators are the problem. They are utility theory-based constructs, so as soon as you deflate consumer expenditure, you're talking about consumer welfare, but they assume substitutability of the goods in the index, they assume homotheticity, they assume away the bundling. So there are a lot of problems there with how do we think about converting the revenues that we add up to get macroeconomic aggregates into a real measure that's giving us some handle on what's happening to economic welfare. And if you think about what is measurable and what is not, we've got this intuition that revenues will equal price times quantity, or quality adjusted price times quantity, and we're not even observing a lot of the information that we would need to divide up revenues in that way. So it's pretty straightforward, relatively speaking, to measure revenues in the normal data collection. But only for some market goods and some market services can we observe both price and quantity and quality. And for all of the others, so the other quadrants, well, they're not quadrants, the other categories in here are part of that, that hard to measure 80% in the original table that I showed you. And so, for example, what is a unit of management consultancy? If you're thinking about market services, it's not the length of the PowerPoint deck. Is it the hours worked? Is it a time-based kind of volume measure? Well, that's what the consultancies themselves will think about, but that doesn't seem entirely satisfactory because we can't think about quality in that context. Or even think about something like haircuts, where you can measure the revenues, you can measure the number of customers, but the price charged is itself the signal of quality in that market. So, and then we add in all of these new digital models. Thinking about cryptocurrencies is giving the national statisticians real headaches at the moment. So a whole swathe of the economy that's become hard to observe. And anyway, we're imputing an awful lot of what's in GDP to begin with. So this is the non-market share of GDP. General government obviously is the largest category. Imputed rent is pretty large. Financial intermediation services indirectly measured. One of the villains of the financial crisis. It turned out that the final quarter of 2008 was the quarter the financial sector made its biggest ever contribution to real GDP growth in the UK, because that measure actually measures speculation, risk-taking as part of its output measure. And then the smaller ones here too. So that's getting on for 2/3 of the economy is imputations, if you think of it as a share of GDP. And then that plus household production line at the bottom. Depending how you measure the value of the time spent on household production, that's equal in size roughly to measured GDP. And that's changing because things like open source software, which underpins all of our digital activities, the whole internet and web run on open source software, is being created in the household sector outside GDP. The free entertainment, if anybody gets sucked into the Instagram watching funny videos loop, that's something that's substituting for you watching a paid-for TV service or going to the cinema. What I called in one paper do-it-yourself digital, things like online banking and online travel agency. So there's a lot of substitution happening from the market sector of the economy inside the production boundary to what we call the household sector, but is adding a lot of economically valuable activities outside the market sector. So my argument is that we should take much more seriously non-market activities on both sides of the production boundary. And that means taking seriously non-market valuations and shadow prices. So I haven't talked so much about the climate crisis, but the shadow prices of natural capital goods, but also the shadow price of time, and integrating seriously a time budget constraint and a monetary budget constraint. Thinking about how we classify products. Should we classify bundles? How do we think about price indices for those? And also returns to scale, externalities, and depreciation and sustainability that relate more to the natural capital and the environmental structural shift are things that we need to take more seriously. We've behaved as if nature is free. For some decades after the Second World War, it essentially was, but now it's clearly one of the binding constraints on future economic growth. Digital activity is almost all non-rival. It doesn't behave like market goods. We need to think about it in a different kind of way. So we want a framework that can do all of that, but gives a sort of coherent picture of how the economy is progressing and are people's lives getting better. And can we bring that all together? Because what I've been talking about are some deep dives, and they highlight particular problems, and I've mapped those onto some measurement questions that cause problems for current national statistics. But is there an alternative? And the answer is I'm not sure. But one that I've been thinking about a lot is the concept of inclusive wealth. And this is something that's firmly rooted in economic theory. Ken Arrow, Parth Dasgupta, Carl-Johan Mehler, and others have shown us that if comprehensive wealth, correctly defined and measured, increases, then economic welfare also increases. So they have a one-to-one relationship in that sense. Correctly measured is the key because that involves getting the right shadow prices, and that's not an easy task, something that we're thinking about now in the ESCO framework. But what would that mean? Well, it means thinking beyond the assets that we include in the system of national accounts, and that's that dark square in the middle here. Human capital, clearly, natural capital, so all of the embodied capitals. I've included heritage capital here because I've done some work on that for ONS, but also because in some cultures, heritage capital is a key part of economic welfare. That's part of the debate about the restitution of Aboriginal lands in Australia, for example. And then all of the intangible assets, which can be quite a capacious category, but certainly includes data and the software and so on. And does that give us a framework for thinking about how things are going for society as a whole? Well, I think it might, because it's got some nice characteristics. First of all, they're assets, so it's going to embed sustainability. And the value of the asset will go down if it's being used in a sustainable route. You can think about these assets as a portfolio. You can think about the complements between them, the betas between them, if you like. And that will give us a better idea about how to think. We might not have to build so many concrete flood defences if we could think about substituting green capital instead in the form of wetlands or upland trees. It's a useful frame for decision making. It's being taken up at local authority level quite widely around the country and outside the UK. And it applies at local and national and international level. You can use the framework in that way. And it's also more multidimensional than GDP. There's always been a tension between the simplicity for policymakers of using one number, GDP growth, and the correct intuition that actually welfare has more than one dimension, so we need to look at other things. And so as an example of policy relevance, how am I doing? I'm going to end with an example of some work that we have done recently at the Bennett Institute looking at what we call universal basic infrastructure. So this is taking that inclusive wealth idea and thinking about, well, what do people then have access to that gives them capital services that they can use to get on with their lives, to do whatever economic activities or non-market activities they want to do. And in that definition, we would include traditional infrastructure, so access to the transport network, the broadband network, the quality of the road system, but also natural capital assets, some social capital assets such as the health and education system. And we looked at this across UK local authorities. And so here are some of the examples. And the downward trend in this chart shows you that there has been a decline in access to many of these assets in many parts of the country. The dark bars are 2023, the pale bars are 2014. So in many of these examples, the dark bar is lower, it's gone down. But also you can see the disparity between different kinds of places. And they're not always what you would expect. So Bolton, which is not a wealthy place, has more railway stations than Cambridge, which is a wealthy place. But often it goes the other way around. The gradient is exactly what you would expect. and that there are huge inequalities in people's access to these collective assets. And so thinking about how do you improve the productivity of low productivity parts of the country, this framework allows you to think about what are the priorities for investing. If the local transport network is terrible, then the labour people are going to be trapped in a thin labour market because they can't commute anywhere. If there are not enough reservoirs, then the housing can't be built and the factories and labs can't be built, and so on. So I would argue that the Inclusive Wealth Framework has a lot of attractions, although, as I said, I'm not completely sure that it's the answer to the question I posed about what is the right aggregate framework for thinking about what's happening under this dual structural transformation. So I'm winding to an end. I put the social framework in the title of the talk, and that was inspired by Richard Stone's idea of a social framework. But he meant something very different. What he meant was that you would take the macroeconomic aggregates that he and others had worked on inventing and implementing, and you would disaggregate that to the individual level. And you'd be able to look at socio-demographic characteristics and understand what was happening in the lives of different kinds of people. And actually, with the data that we have available, we've got a long way towards his vision, because we now have amazing longitudinal databases that give us all of that individual information. But I want to argue that what we need now is the opposite. We need a framework for thinking about the collective outcome, the aggregate outcome, in a way that is not the sum of individual outcomes. And that's because so much of the economy as it's emerging is characterized by non-rivalry, increasing returns to scale, non-market kinds of transactions, and that's what we need to be thinking about. So I think this is a really exciting and rich research agenda. How do we think about volume? What are the right kind of categories? Should we go back to Lancaster's idea of basic goods instead of the kind of consumer goods that we are used to having in our classifications? How do we think about price as a quality signal, or indeed as a market power signal, because we know that many of the OECD economies have experienced increasing concentration, so there are a lot of rents in there as well. Thinking about bundles, thinking about intangibles as the capabilities of individual firms that might help explain why the new technologies are becoming so hard to use. Thinking about a time budget constraint, extending that framework that Becker wrote about in 1963, but which he never fully integrated in all of his work. He went micro, not macro with it. Non-market activities are a large part of the economy, they're a growing part of the economy, and so we need new approaches to valuing non-market activities and shadow prices. So I think this is a great research agenda, and I want to end up where I started, with a reminder that GDP is just an idea. This is me some years ago holding in Cheetham's library in Manchester the copy of Petty's Political Arithmetic that had been used by Marx and Engels when they were studying there to write the Communist Manifesto. So GDP is an idea that replaced earlier conceptions like Petty's, which was entirely different, and it will change. The SNA 25 revision will change things at the margin. It will introduce some environmental characteristics. It will add data, but they're incremental changes. So I think my challenge is that by the time GDP reaches 100 in 2041, we need something different. And I hope that some of the people here will be part of that endeavour, which is a collective endeavour. I want to thank a lot of my co-authors and other people, and end with a little bit of an advert for both my previous books and the next book, The Measure of Progress, ? Which I hope will come out sometime next year. So thanks very much, and I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Sorry. So your proposed solution is a stock measure. And I'm trying to think about what that's going to look like in when you think about kind of flows. GDP, the complaint about GDP is it's a flow measure, and it's part of the complaint. And then you're proposing something which is a stock measure, which is measuring overall assets. But it's hard to see how that's going to work well in terms of the purpose of GDP about trying to think about whether we're moving into recessions, how should monetary policy respond, and so on. It feels like a stock measure is going to be a bad way of thinking about what we should be doing in terms of aggregate policy or monetary policy.
So I think I've got two answers to that. One is that there will always be a need for a nominal aggregate flow measure that's something like GDP for macroeconomic policy. And in practice, you would often measure the flows of services from these different kinds of capital because it's a much harder task to estimate the value of the stock, although in some cases you can get the quantity of the stock. But the point about highlighting stocks is that that's where the sustainability comes in. So I might be extracting positive capital services from a certain natural asset year by year, but I also would want to know, was I depleting that? So there would come a tipping point beyond which I would get no capital services from it.
So thank you very much for that really interesting talk, Diane. So I wanted to go and pick up on one bit that you were talking about of the value of data. And in particular, like, you know, the fact that, like, you know, the data infrastructure is going to go and be accounted for as an asset going forward. And one of the things that, being a microeconomist, I use a lot of the data, household surveys data produced from the ONS. And I was wondering, do you have a stance on, there are certain countries, I'm thinking of the Scandinavian countries, that ask researchers essentially to go and pay for access to the data, versus the approach that we've taken in the UK, my understanding in the UK, that much data is free to access for researchers. Of course, we have to fill in a lot, there's a large time cost. And do you have a stance on which one that you think would work better in terms of, like, you know, forwarding research?
Well, data is a non-rival good, so it's got public good characteristics, and in that sense, more people can access data to use it for economically valuable activities, the better. The trade-off is obviously that reduces the commercial value for the entities that hold it, so that's going to be a hard-fought battle. I've been interested in trying to estimate the value because there need to be business cases made. So you might say, this is a really quixotic endeavour, why are you even trying to do it? And the answer is because if you want to make a case to the Treasury to invest in public data, or you want to make a case to the Competition Commission about the value of making some companies open up their data, or you want to make a case to the Geospatial Commission to make it free for individual users but to charge Google the Earth for Google Earth, then you need to have some kind of numbers there. And that's why I think it's interesting and worth trying to do this. But at the moment, we're coming up with very different kinds of numbers from the different methods that we use. And I think the challenge is understanding what a volume unit of data is in a more systematic way, as in the financial markets. There's a great story by Donald Mackenzie at Edinburgh University about the creation of options markets. And the prices used to be incredibly widely dispersed for options until the capital asset pricing model came along, and that led everybody to converge onto a standardized format for those financial market prices. So he's got a great London Review of Books article about it that's well worth looking up. That's what I think would have to happen to other kinds of data for markets to emerge.
Just looking to see if there's any other hands up. Oh, yeah, Gary. There's a
People at the back need to start asking some questions too.
No, thanks very much, it's a brilliant lecture, and it's really, it kind of took me back to my own time working in input-output tables and trying to understand GDP, what was formal, non-formal. In government, we really struggle with the value of the public sector and actually how you measure that. If you think about education, what's the value of smaller class sizes, how you bring that quality dimension in. But I want to ask you about something slightly different, again in the kind of non-market sector, about the kind of debate about extending GDP maybe to bring in the value, say, of informal care, and the kind of the feminist economists argue for that. I like the approach that you're articulating there in terms of the kind of four capitals framework. But so a question about care, another one about how you would pick up the likes of natural capital use will be picked up in the kind of standard national accounts. Some of it will be picked up in that. Is there issues maybe about double counting there?
Yes, so that's one of the real challenges at the moment. So the value of natural capital to some extent will be capitalised in house values, which we would already have some measures for. So there are a number of overlaps like that, which in the end it will come down to, as it always does in national accounting, some essentially arbitrary boundary choices, and we just don't know yet where the double counting is happening, and that's a live debate that's going on in the international statistics community, so that's absolutely right. The other kind of accounting that might be interesting is time accounting, and that goes to those activities crossing the production boundary, but again, all of the volunteer activity, all of the household activity that currently isn't included, but clearly those, we don't get up saying, how much shall we spend today? We get up saying, what should we do today? There's a hand in the middle there, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So my question was, there is a lot of already some measures that try to take into account environment, like green GDP or the well-being index. Do you think any of these should work as a blueprint, or any of these are the ones we should be looking forward to exploit a little bit more?
So on the whole, I'm not a fan of adjustments that in terms of economic theory will look arbitrary, because when you're combining things into that kind of index, you've got a lot of implicit relative valuations that are not always thought through. You could do things, as my colleague Matthew Agawala has done, like adjust GDP for energy intensity, and so you get a sort of national accounts and economic theory consistent green GDP in that sense. So they are interesting. I guess what I struggle with, and I don't have the answer to, is thinking about all of these things in an integrated way. So in this corner, I've got all my digital problems. In this corner, I've got natural capital. In the other corner, I've got the degradation of the public realm, and what is that doing to the capacity of the economy to grow? So what I don't have yet, and I'm not sure I will have by the time the book comes out either, is what's the integrated way of thinking about that. And obviously those kinds of indices are people trying to integrate, but they're not integrating everything that needs to go in.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So before we thank Diane once again for a fantastic talk, I just want to remind you all that we have the Welcome Civic reception tonight at Glasgow City Chambers. The details are in your conference app. And on behalf of the Scottish Economic Society, just a small gift to say thank you very much, Diane, for an excellent talk, including your own piece of Adam Smith, Official Tartan, which from the Scottish Economic Society. So
thank you so much.
Once again.
Everybody.